hands on the cards on I would like to welcome today's witness, Anton Bogman, who's the nominee for position of Foreign Influence Transparency Commissioner. You have 5 minutes to deliver your opening remarks.
Thank you. And good morning, Mr. Chair, committee members. Bonjour, Monsieur le Président et membres du comité.
Good morning, Chair and committee members.
Before this committee in relation to my nomination as Foreign Influence Transparency Commissioner. Canada's institutions and interests are increasingly under threat from foreign interference. Malign foreign actors seek to exert influence through covert means to shape public policy, to change public opinion, or interfere with our democratic processes, all to support their own interests. A critical measure to counter these activities is transparency. Canadians need to know who is trying to influence them and why. The Office of the Foreign Influence Transparency Commissioner is being established to enable this transparency, to enforce the rules and regulations that will govern what types of influence activity need to be disclosed, and to support the efforts of other agencies and offices in protecting Canadian institutions and interests. C'est pour moi un honneur que ma candidature au...
I am honored to be nominated for the position of Commissioner. I have dedicated my entire career to protecting and supporting our democracy, first as a naval officer and then, for the past 7 years, as Chief Electoral Officer of British Columbia, an independent and non-partisan role. And in 2018, in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, I became aware of the risks associated with disinformation and foreign interference in our elections. My reports to the British Columbia Legislative Assembly on these issues led to the adoption of cutting-edge legislation against deliberate disinformation while maintaining the protections provided by the Charter.
I believe that while effective legislation is necessary, a multifaceted approach is better. In 2023, in response to evolving risks to elections, I established an election integrity working group, unique at the provincial level, bringing together other provincial and federal agencies with roles in protecting democracy. I believe this experience is directly relevant to the mandate of the office and demonstrates my ability to build the kinds of partnerships and information sharing pathways that will be essential for consistent application of the Foreign Influence Transparency and Accountability Act nationwide. My service as an independent officer of the BC Legislature has provided me with the necessary skills, knowledge, and experience to be successful in the role of Commissioner. I've administered elections, implemented registers, regulated election advertising, campaign finance. I've carried out large-scale communications campaigns and interpreted and enforced the rules in a fair and nonpartisan manner. My values of accessibility, integrity, transparency, accountability, and service guide my decision-making and are aligned with what is required in the Commissioner role. This is a new office in the process of being established. If I have the honour of being appointed Commissioner, my priorities will be to launch and operationalize the office and registry, to engage with communities likely to be targeted, and build public awareness of the office, the registry, and the rules. It's critically important to ensure that there is clarity about the rules and that they are understood. I would also work to establish and operationalize partnerships required to support this mandate, for example, with CSIS and the RCMP. And I believe it's essential to start enforcing the rules promptly and to report publicly on that activity. Citizens need to see this work in action. Only then will it work to support efforts to strengthen public trust in our democratic institutions by making transparent foreign influence activities and reinforcing fairness through a nonpartisan approach to enforcement. Mon message aux Canadiennes et aux Canadiens.
My message to Canadians is this. Should I be appointed as Canada's first Foreign Influence Transparency Commissioner, I will work unfailingly to ensure that activities to influence political and governmental processes in Canada are made transparent, that foreign actors are deterred from attempting covert influence actions in Canada, and that the regulatory code currently under development is enforced.
Canadians is this. Should I be appointed as Canada's first Foreign Influence Transparency Commissioner, I will work unfailingly to ensure that activities to influence political and government processes in Canada are made transparent, that foreign actors are deterred from attempting covert influence actions in Canada, and that the regulatory code currently under development is enforced. I hope that I can count on your support. Thank you. Merci.
Much. We'll now go to Mr. Cooper for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Boegman, getting the Foreign Influence Registry up and running has been a real challenge for this government. There has been delay after delay. To be clear, that's not your fault, that's their fault. First, the Liberals said the registry would be up and running before the last election. Then they said it would be up and running in June of 2025. Then it was supposed to be in place by December of 2025. When the Minister of Public Safety last appeared before this committee earlier this month, he had a vague new timeline, spring of this year. You've been nominated to serve as the Commissioner of the Registry. Do you have any idea when the registry will be up and running?
At this time, I don't have a timeline as to how when the registry will be up and running. I am simply a nominee. I've been engaged in the process to get me to this point. I have not been engaged in any level of detail with the work that's been ongoing to establish the office and to get the registry up and running. I can say that it would be a priority of mine to get the registry up and running, whether it's in an interim format, whether it is in the complete technological solution that would be necessary. I can say that I would work immediately to start developing the necessary guidance, the necessary information bulletins to establish clarity about the rest.
Thank you for that. Now, you indicated that you've had no involvement up until this point with getting the registry up and running. So I want to just be clear. For example, in January, the Department of Public Safety released draft regulations. There was a public consultation period that ended at the beginning of this month. I take it you were not involved in any way in preparing the draft regulations. Do I have that right?
That is correct. I've read the regulations, obviously, but I've had no role in preparing the regulations.
And the final regulations are being prepared. That process is underway. Are you involved in that process?
I'm not involved in that process.
So you've not been consulted whatsoever?
No.
Okay. And in terms of staff, have staff for the office been hired?
My understanding is that there is a transition team that's housed in public safety that's doing the work right now to get the office in readiness. My understanding is that more staff will need to be hired once I'm in place.
Well, to get the office to readiness, you said more staff will need to be hired once you're appointed, but have any staff been hired that will be housed on a permanent basis?
I do not know that.
You do not know that. Okay. Well, you would agree that the independence of your office is key to your office functioning and the registry functioning properly and free from interference. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think independence of the role is critical.
Yeah. So does it concern you from the standpoint of ensuring that independence that the Department of Public Safety drafted regulations, is now in the process of finalizing what are draft regulations without any input whatsoever from you, the almost certainly soon-to-be commissioner?
I think that's largely a function of how the legislation has been drafted, and that a commissioner cannot be in place until the law is in effect. But it's not unlike the model that, when I was appointed Chief Electoral Officer in British Columbia, there was obviously a code that was in place for the administration of those elections, for the campaign finance requirements, and that is the code that was used. And once I was in office, I was able to assess whether I thought it was effective, where I thought the gaps might be in, to make recommendations for change. I am pleased to see that much of the detail in relation to the registry are set out in regulations which provide greater flexibility in the future to evolve what is required for the registry as the threats change.
Now, once you are appointed as commissioner, you're going to have a big job ahead of you, given the very real threats posed by foreign interference actors. The government has allocated $25 million to the office over the next 10 years. That, works out to roughly $2.5 million every year, and that includes everything from securing office space to setting up, supporting IT infrastructure, to paying salaries for staff. So, from your standpoint, are you satisfied that your office is sufficiently resourced to do the job of administering and enforcing the registry?
I must confess I have not yet had the opportunity to do a detailed plan as to what I think would be necessary being in the role. I have to have some level of trust that sufficient resources will be provided in order to be effective in that role, and I do know that there are mechanisms to seek additional funding if I believe that that additional funding is necessary. And that's very, again, similar to my background as Chief Electoral Officer. When I required additional funding to take on a new mandate to do additional things, I would appear before the appropriate legislative committees to request that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cooper. We'll turn to Madame Kayabagha for 6 minutes, please.
Chair, welcome. I would like to first congratulate you on making it to this step, and just give you an opportunity to kind of, tell us about yourself and how you see yourself qualified to do this job. And my first question would be, from your perspective, how do you see Foreign Influence Transparency Registry contributing to Canada's fight against foreign interference and transnational repression? And would you say that you have experienced any cases in which a registry would have aided in countering a threat?
Certainly. So thank you for that. I think, as I explained briefly in my opening comments, I do think that my experience as Chief Electoral Officer is directly relevant to the role here. The role of the registry itself and the Office of the Foreign Influence Transparency Commissioner is just about that. It's about transparency in those activities which are undertaken at the behest of or in association with the foreign principal to influence Canadian governmental and political processes. Yeah. So it is one tool in a range of tools. In fact, it is one element of what I believe should really be a whole of government or a whole of society approach in being able to respond effectively to the risks of transnational repression, the risks that are posed to our democratic institutions from foreign interference. So this piece will, of course, look to make transparent those activities when they are taking place. It'll also, I think, serve to deter those who may want to undertake these activities in a covert fashion. I do have experience in establishing a register. We had lots of registers in British Columbia, the Register of Electors, over 3.5 million voters, which needed to be maintained and updated on a regular basis. We had registries of political parties. We had registries of third-party advertising sponsors. So I do have direct experience in that area.
That's going to be my follow-up question, whether you had any cases or any specific events that you could point to where you have had to do this work. Obviously, this is going to be, the first time that we have a commissioner in this role. What do you think you're going to be working on in the first couple of months, and how do you see? Obviously, foreign interference is something that electors are talking about. How do we bring community trust? How do you play a role in re-bridging that community trust that people need to continue to trust our systems when it comes to foreign interference in elections?
So maybe I'll touch on the last part of your question first. I think establishing trust or rebuilding trust, that's an outcome that will occur through successful implementation of the mandate, through the carrying out of the activities that are necessary. I think for me, obviously, moving in, it's going to be a brand new office, so establishing that office, operationalizing the registry, getting the registry in place. I think working on things like defining making definitions when they're necessary, establishing interpretation bulletins, establishing guidance, and then communicating that guidance so that it's clear on what the rules are when people do need to register, when they need to inscribe themselves on the registry, and those sorts of things. I think that there needs to be lots of outreach. There needs to be outreach, particularly among communities that are affected by some of the issues that we are facing. I think there needs to be outreach in the academic community. I think there needs to be a broad outreach around what the registry means, what the focus of the registry is, what the object of the registry is in terms of transparency, greater transparency in these types of activities. So I think that these sorts of things would be priorities for me if I were to be appointed into this role. And I think the outcome of doing those successfully would be to broaden trust.
How do you think this establishment of the Foreign Influence Transparency Registry will help Canada be able to further contribute to bilateral and multilateral cooperation in the efforts to counter foreign interference across board?
So a foreign influence registry is a tool. It is a very effective tool in my belief, but it's one tool among many. It's also a tool that has been used by some of our allies. So there is a registry, I'm sure, as you know, in the UK and Australia. The US has had legislation in this area since the late 1930s. So it's bringing us into line with what is currently used by many of our allies in the same area. So I think that it will help to reinforce some of those relationships that we have, knowing that this tool is now in place and that there are means to have greater transparency of some of these influence activities that are taking place targeting our processes.
Some people may be a little skeptical and think that the government is trying to overreach. How will you handle not under enforcing and also not overreaching?
Well, I have to trust, obviously, that in the development of the legislation, it has met the requirements of the Charter, obviously balancing any time that there is regulations that are affecting people, what people have to do, then there has to be a trade-off between the necessity of those and, of course, the rights that are established for all Canadians in the Charter. My experience, again, drawing from that back in British Columbia, there are times when you are regulated in terms of what you can say and when you can say it through the election advertising laws and the campaign finance laws. And so these are deemed as being necessary in order to have a greater good, which in that case is preservation of the fair playing field and the level playing field in an election campaign. So I think that there's obviously a need for a foreign influence transparency register, that the application of that will be key, but that the application is really to have greater transparency, not to be used as a tool to persecute or a tool to repress.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Madame Normandin, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Bogman, pour
Thank you, Mr. Bogman, for being with us today. You mentioned that one of the cornerstones of your role is to focus on independence. There are some things that wouldn't be in your responsibility, certain investigations that would fall under CSIS, or looking at the assessment of geopolitical threats that would be done by another entity. But do you believe that there might be some contradictions between information coming from CSIS and information given by the Prime Minister? For example, the Prime Minister is going to India, and he said that there is no risk, that India is posing no risk, and yet, even only a few months ago, CSIS was saying that there are still criminal threats. So how are you going to be able to strike a balance there, knowing that you're getting information from one side and from another, and you need to remain neutral and find the truth throughout all of that? Thank you for the question. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak in French. I am not a francophone, and Canada's second official language is not my first language. And so I would like to apologize if I make any mistakes or use any anglicisms in my response. This is a good question. We might have some information that indicates one thing or another, and it will be up to the Commissioner to create partnerships with other agencies in order to have access to all of the necessary information, and then I would be able to make a decision regarding foreign influence. If I need to reach out to an individual or an entity and to see whether or not they need to be on the registry, I need to have all that information. Thank you, and your French is great. Thank you. Regarding those investigative powers, how will you be able to do additional research if you have access to a bank account to see if there are any strange transactions? How could that be a part of your mandate, and what kind of partners could you work with in order to access that kind of information? It will be important to have partnerships with different institutions, with law enforcement and different agencies. In order to see what's going on. The Office of the Commissioner is going to be a small team of around 30 people, and we are going to focus on transparency. If I detect an issue between an individual and a foreign entity, and if they're communicating with a member of parliament, for example, or if I detect any financial issues, I need to ensure that that individual is registered. So partnerships are very important and need to be done with all types of organizations. Will you have an agnostic approach, if I can say it that way, of people who can have an influence? Or do you already have certain countries in mind who have attempted foreign influence in the past and who have your attention already? The system is agnostic. It's for each incident, each case, each person. I'm certain that there are countries who have been identified as acting in Canada, for example, China, India, Russia. We need to know what these countries are doing, and so we need to have partnerships with other agencies. I can't think of the word that I'm going for, but the registry is agnostic. It's for each incident, entity, and individual who would need to be included on that registry.
Mr. Van Popte, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Boogman, welcome. Nice to have a fellow British Columbian in the room.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Well, you're applying for this job in part on your credentials as the successful Chief Electoral Officer for British Columbia. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions around that. I hope you don't mind. Particularly around the most recent provincial election, 2024, the 43rd election. And I'm going to focus on the riding called Surrey-Guildford, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. That was a riding where the NDP incumbent won by a narrow margin of 22 votes. And so obviously those 22 votes were very important to the people in that riding, and this supports our argument, our pep talk with our volunteers that every vote counts. But in this case, it was really particular because it actually had an influence at the provincial level, because if that vote had gone the other way, Mr. Eby would have been denied his one vote majority. My facts are right, correct?
Yes.
So far, good.
Correct.
Thank you. Now, you'll also be aware that the unsuccessful candidate, the Conservative candidate, Mr. Randhawa, commenced legal action to overturn the certification of the vote, arguing that there were some voting irregularities at a senior's home, which coincidentally had 22 mail-in ballots. And all those, the requests for those mail-in ballots came from one ISP, a computer that was tied to the administrative office of that facility. So it was somebody doing this in a coordinated fashion. Now, you state in the court documents, paragraph 98, receiving multiple requests for mail-in packages from a single computer, session, or location does not on its own signal to Elections BC that there has been any wrongdoing or contravention of the Elections Act. I would agree with that assessment. But then you go on to say the vote by mail team decided to fulfill the request from the facility to ensure the voters received their mail-in packages in time. In the next sentence I would underline. However, the team failed to follow up with the district electoral officer, Ms. Dolly, right, for that riding, to confirm that the individual at the facility was appointed as an election official. So somebody dropped the ball. And now I take being appointed as election official would require some basic training, like perhaps how to help patients under their care to vote without influencing their vote. And that seems not to have happened. So can the voters of Surrey-Guildford rest assured that those 22 mail-in ballots did not influence the outcome of the vote in that riding, and that the vote as you certified it is the true expression of the majority of that riding?
Thank you for the question. There may be some parts to that I'm very happy to respond to. Others are in the hands of Elections BC. I'm no longer, of course, the Chief Electoral Officer there. The lawsuit was filed. The lawsuit was dropped by the candidate in Surrey-Guildford. That happened after my term ended, so I have no information in relation to why that happened, what was behind that. I do know that the plan, at least when I was Chief Electoral Officer, was if the proceedings would take place in court, then the courts would determine validly what happened and what didn't happen. If they would not, then it would be an investigation for Elections BC to do. And so I can't speak to Elections BC.
I'm going to challenge you just a bit on that, because you do say in the same document that Mr. Randhawa was just out of time. He missed the limitation period. So Elections BC was basically saved by the bell. He had to drop the case, move on, live to fight another day. But my concern is that it's particularly such a tight race, whether Elections BC actually exercised the due diligence that you would have expected as a professional, that your team lived up to the demands of the day.
So the requirement to appoint an individual as an election official is something that is done, but is not required under the legislation. It's not absolutely necessary under the legislation.
But in this case, it might have been appropriate. I've also read the affidavit of the Green candidate who said that he had tried to canvass and was told, no, these people are all sick. They don't vote. Yet 22 people did cast a vote. Raises some suspicion anyways. I would have expected perhaps some alarm bells would have started going in your office.
So I can say that based on the information that I was provided as Chief Electoral Officer, I believe that the election was administered in accordance with the legislation. I do not believe that that activities counter to that took place.
Fair enough. It'll never be tested in court, of course. One follow-up question? How were the
Is it
lessons
a very
how are the elections,
you don't get
the
to,
lesson from,
Mr. Van
election
Popta, you don't
43?
get to rule on your.
Okay.
Go ahead. We have a little bit of time. You can
Okay.
go ahead, but
How are
maybe a very brief
lead you up
question.
with a friendly question. How are the lessons of Election 43 going to help you be a better foreign influence transparency commissioner for all of Canada?
So there's always lessons to be learned in various roles and from different people that I associate with. So I think for me, what was reinforced is that training can always be better. Training of the staff who are performing roles can always be better, even though you put what you think is decent training in. Whenever there are people who are interacting at these roles, human nature and complexity of legislation can mean that inadvertent errors are possible to take place. So you can always improve the training. You always have to put in checks and balances in everything. I think making assumptions is never a good thing. You need to follow up and make those assumptions. In the end of the day, you're providing a service. You need to make sure that that's done properly.
Thank you so much. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So, Mr. Lewis, you have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank Mr. Bogman, our potential first Foreign Influence Transparency Commissioner, to this committee. And thank you for your willingness to put your name forward in this important role. The Foreign Influence Transparency and Accountable Act establishes a new framework intended to strengthen transparency and protect the integrity of Canada's democratic institutions. As Parliament considers this nomination, it's important that the committee understand not only your professional qualifications, but also how you'll approach the practical responsibilities of standing up for this new oversight office. As previously mentioned, Mr. Bogman, your experience as Chief Electoral Officer in British Columbia serves you well. You mentioned that provincially you brought forward a multifaceted approach, and that included bringing together a working group, which you said was unique at the provincial level. Can you share with this committee what lessons you learned from bringing that working group together?
So the working group, I brought that together primarily because I felt that as the head of the election agency, I didn't have all the information that was necessary in order to fully understand whether there were any actors at play in the electoral process that we weren't aware of. So I engaged with local representation from CSIS, from the RCMP, provincially with the Office of the Chief Information Officer, with the Registrar of Lobbyists in British Columbia, with the provincial government as well. So we needed to bring together people who had access to different sources of information, people who were able to see areas that we just didn't have visibility into. I found at the time everyone was very interested in working together. At the time, however, the information sharing pathways were not as direct as I would have liked. Although I'm pleased to see that some of the changes that have been made, for example, now allow CSIS to have an MOU with a provincial partner in order to exchange information on things. I found that having the group set up as of itself was a great thing because it allowed us to practice, to plan, to do scenario planning, to understand if something should happen, what would the response be? Which agency would have that lever? Which agency was best positioned to respond to that threat? Whether it was something that was counter to the campaign finance laws, for example, or perhaps it was a criminal offense. So it really helped crystallize the role of the different agency as we commonly looked across the risk to the democratic process. So that to me was the biggest one, is just knowing the different roles, knowing who has the levers, knowing which tool can be used to accomplish the end goal.
And that doesn't depend on an election cycle itself. It sounds like that
That
work
can be
is
ongoing, yes.
Okay. The team that you would be in charge of seems to be around 30 people. How big was the provincial team, approximately?
I think there was 80 full-time equivalents at elections, BC just under 80 full-time equivalents. We did have access to using temporary staff under the legislation, so typically, depending upon the cycle, there would be an extra 20 to 30 people in the office. During a provincial election, we would have around 250 people at the headquarters office, and of course, 25,000 people in the field.
Right, okay. You also mentioned that our closest allies and partners, like the Five Eyes, possess similar mechanisms as we're setting up a foreign influence transparency registry. How will you be able to work with our other partners and allies to share information, share best practices? How often are they meeting already on their own and would be now invited to the table, or is this something that you've considered how to approach this?
So that's a little bit of putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah.
I'm not certain how those organizations meet. I can speak to, obviously, in my background, I did engage with other election management bodies, whether they were, there were regular meetings of Canadian election management bodies, but I also knew that there's lots of great engagement that could happen internationally with other countries. So I was an advocate for that. So I would certainly look to establish those relationships, understand how they have implemented their registries. Obviously, there's different legislation guiding each registry. Ours is country agnostic, for example, as I'm sure you know, whereas the British one has different tiers in it. So just understanding what those mean, whether they find those are successful. As the legislation is implemented and the office is up and running and starting to do its work, then I think you're always looking for areas where you can innovate, where you see that there's perhaps a gap, and often ways to overcome that come from other organizations.
Yeah, thank you. And you'd say that there would be patterns that you would
Yes,
see within.
for sure.
Okay. Lastly, you said you would be engaging with communities that would likely be targeted. You mentioned, and that brings on transnational repression. You said we need to establish trust or rebuild trust. What measures of communication you mentioned the academic sector, maybe cultural groups. What's the best way you think we can reach out to establish that trust and build that relationship with cultural groups, with academia?
I need to meet them in person. I will need to there's a number of organizations. I know certainly I followed very closely the work of Commissioner Hogue and understand the input that she received. I know that work is ongoing, but certainly for me it would be identifying these groups and meeting with them in person and establishing regular ways to communicate back and forth. Thank you.
3.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup. Vous avez parlé.
Thank you, Chair. You talked about your experience in creating registries in the past. We know that Australia was criticized for a costly registry that was not very efficient, and our government here wants IT programs that are often very costly and not very efficient. I would like to hear you talk about two things. The flexibility that you'll have for creating that registry, is it something that will come from you exclusively? Will you be responsible for all the decision making? And also, can you talk about the qualities in a good registry? What are you looking for? What would be the ease of use that you'd be looking for, and timeliness? Thank you for the question. To start with the first part of your question, the registry is currently being developed. We don't have a final version. We have an interim version. It might not be the best solution. It's very important to have a registry that is user-friendly. The information needs to be clear, and it must be easy to follow the steps for including information. We also need to have this information in various languages. There might be some who need to be registered for whom English won't be their first language. If I am appointed commissioner, that responsibility would become mine entirely, yes. Currently, it is shared with others. And how are you going to ensure that those who need to register will receive that information that they need to be registered? Are you going to have an awareness campaign? Communication is very important. We can create bulletins, information documents. In BC, we have information in 16 languages for the different communities. That way it's easy for them to understand the rules and what they need to do in order to register. We want to use the media. We want to have a presence online. We want to use social media. So there are different ways, yes.
Jackson, please. 6 minutes. But I will be firm on the 6 minutes.
Fair, Mr. Chair. Welcome. Nice to meet you. I just wanted to follow up on a line of questioning from my colleague, Mr. Cooper. We've established that a lot of things are out of your control yet with the establishment of this registry, and I think that's fair. But I just want to make sure that despite all of that, that what you can control, if you're confirmed into this position within the next month or so, that from what you can control, you will be ready to go on day one that you're confirmed into this role.
Yes.
Okay. Are you confident in given everything that's ongoing that you're being set up for success in this role, given what you've seen?
I believe I'm being set up for success, but I know that I do have other mechanisms. For example, if I believe additional funding is necessary, that I can pursue those mechanisms.
Can you share what those mechanisms are?
I think they're the same mechanisms that any federal agency would use to access funding through Treasury Board. I'm certainly believe that this is a very important issue for all parliamentarians, and that that there will be support for the efforts of the office and to ensure that the office receives the funding that's necessary to be successful.
Thank you. You'll be aware of recent legislation that passed both houses in terms of removing the first-generation limit for Canadian citizenship for Canadians living abroad. So that expands the number of people who are eligible around the world for Canadian citizenship. And I'm just curious, you talked a little bit in your opening comments about interacting with Canadians and communities. How do you plan on engaging with Canadian citizens abroad if you're confirmed in this role?
Yeah, so I think that would be an area where I would look to perhaps Global Affairs for expertise in how to speak to Canadians abroad. Certainly, online presence is a very good way to provide information that can be accessible from anywhere in the world. I think in designing how that information is made available will be important. I think there are, there are groups, there are community groups that represent Canadians who are abroad or other individuals who are abroad. I think working through the diplomatic service would be another way to make sure that information is available.
When we asked some folks from Global Affairs and the Prime Minister's, well, now Ambassador to France, but formerly National Security Advisor, and a few others, they were not sure exactly how their efforts in terms of the Global Affairs response to foreign interference were going to interact with Canadians living abroad given these legislative changes. So I'm just a little bit concerned that the legislation is passed and is in effect, and the global affairs team doesn't seem to have any idea how they're going to respond to that increased number of citizens. So I just would encourage you, if you could flesh out a little bit more over the process as to what your interactions your office is going to have with Canadians abroad. I think that's a bit of a concern for a lot of people. And also I wonder about the registry itself and those who should be on it. It's one thing to collect that information from people within Canada that are operating that way, but how do you see your office interacting with those folks who are operating in other countries to Canadian diaspora communities?
Yeah, so the law, of course, applies to anyone, regardless of whether they're in Canada or outside of Canada. And so identifying those individuals and communicating with them is going to be critically important. I think that there are, specific instances where there is an individual or an entity that meets the criteria to register. So that's one avenue. I would think would be easier ways to communicate with them. There could be obviously covert activity that I would receive information from through partnerships with law enforcement or CSIS or other agencies, and obviously would work to try to establish contact and to require registration. I think in general, just making sure that information about the register, about the requirements to register, clarity on definitions, information bulletins, just making sure that those are available, online obviously being the best means to have that presence available to those who are not in Canada, or indeed for people across Canada. We have such a large and diverse country. But having that available, multilingual access to that, I think is going to be important.
Thank you. I just am curious, you mentioned a bit, I think in a response to another question about detecting interactions between actors and Canadians or elected officials, including financial interactions. Did I hear you correctly?
That's really just in relation to the criteria that are necessary for someone to register, right? So there's one of the criteria is that there's a passing or dissemination of funds or something of value. So I would look forward to making sure that I would have ways to understand whether that was taking place.
And how would you envision that looking for Canadians living abroad in detecting financial or the items of value interacting between a foreign actor and a Canadian citizen living in pick a country?
It would be very challenging, obviously. So I would have to rely on other agencies to provide support in that area. The focus of the Transparency Commissioner obviously is on providing that transparency to Canadians through the register, whereas there are other agencies, federal agencies, who have direct responsibility, intelligence gathering and those sorts of things.
Thank you so much. We'll turn to Mr. Greaves for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, Mr. Boagman. Thank you for being here. As a fellow British Columbian and as the MP for Victoria, I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank you for your work in our home province and for your service most recently in the 2024 provincial election. Your experience in British Columbia, I think, will serve you in good stead in this role federally, given that many of the issues that you will have dealt with in that capacity will be, mirrored at the federal level as well. And one of the issues that we know is of particular significance at the moment, perhaps one of the greatest challenges in our politics and to our electoral systems, has to do with misinformation and disinformation, which is being deliberately spread by bad actors, some of them located outside of our borders, who seek to confuse and ultimately misinform Canadians for their own ends. Could you speak, please, to how you've addressed online disinformation and misinformation in your previous role in British Columbia and how you tackle it should you be appointed as Commissioner?
So certainly addressing it in my previous role, when I first was appointed as Chief Electoral Officer, I remember having lunch with the Privacy Commissioner of BC, and he pointed me to a report that a British parliamentary committee had tabled on the issue of misinformation and disinformation. And en route to a meeting in Newfoundland, I read that tome cover to cover, and that was my introduction to the threat, to what had been going on, and what some possible solutions were. So I used that, I made it required reading for my management team, and that resulted in a report that I tabled with our legislators addressing the dangers of misinformation and disinformation in the election space. I was fortunate to be able to work with legislators in BC to enact, change the law to have specific prohibitions about certain forms of misinformation and disinformation, some which mirror what's currently in the Canada Elections Act. But that was unique in British Columbia, had not been done before, and we were able to implement that in the last election. I think that there was a lot of knowledge about these new provisions, and I think there was a deterrent effect from the knowledge of that, because there weren't many instances where we needed to apply that law in that case. But I think it's resulted in a system that is much more robust, a system that much more reflects the modern environment and what some of the evolving risks to elections and to our democracy have been. So certainly that is how I approach that in this case. In the role as commissioner, should I be confirmed in this role, I think I need to understand or assess what that risk is and what could take place with what the specific requirements of the law are for the register. The Canadian register, as I understand it, it's not one like the U.S. FARA laws, which can focus on public opinion activities to influence public opinion. It's a narrower definition in the current legislation. So you'd need to be able to define and understand whether some activities are taking place. It may meet a broader definition of disinformation, but it may not meet the requirements of the Act and require legislation if it's not being aimed at a political or a governmental process. So really understanding that, being able to define that, being able to communicate what those requirements are, and then moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. Boagman. And Mr. Chair, I'll be sharing the rest of my time with my colleague, Mr. Sari.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Également, merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Boagman, for being with us today. We used to talk about foreign interference and we used to talk a lot about financing and disinformation in the media, and we are now in a digital era with generative AI. Now, systems can create knowledge that is sent to Canadians, and this can lead to different political narratives. Do you believe that this could create a risk because it could create content that would influence people? Yes. AI is perhaps a little bit new in this environment, but we have seen in the United States and other countries the ways AI are being used by different actors. The first thing that we need to fight is the impact. We need to fight against the impacts of that interference. We can create social media posts, and include information that states that an ad was created by AI. That makes it clear for Canadians that it is not real, that it was created by AI.
Excellent. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Boagman. Thank you, Chair.
Go. We're going to have a 2-minute round each based on a request from the Conservatives. We'll do 2 minutes each. I will again be firm on the 2 minutes, so we'll go to Mr. Cram.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Boagman, one of the most common criticisms of the old long gun registry was that honest, law-abiding Canadians would proactively go out and register their firearms, but hardened criminals who never had any intention of abiding by the law anyway would not go and register their firearms, and we all know how that worked out. So I'm a bit concerned that we're going down the same pathway with the foreign interference registry. So, Mr. Boogman, how would you ensure that this foreign interference registry is actually effective and doesn't just end up inconvenience people who are following the law anyway?
So I think again, I have not been part of the process to get to this point, other than having my name having my name be brought forward, and obviously it's an area that I'm tremendously interested in, and I think there's a real need for it, and I think that the potential negative impact on our democracy is significant. So I think one of the key parts to this to the law and to the regulations underneath is a wide range of administrative monetary penalties that can be applied. I think that from my understanding, it's far greater, the top end of that, than even what's in the U.S. FARA laws. And so that allows for a very robust response when you identify these instances where there have been contraventions against the requirements, people not registering, people not updating when they need to, when these activities are taking place. So I think that will actually form a strong deterrent for these types of covert activities from taking place. Obviously, it's not going to prevent it. I'm not naive. I think that, interference activities, they've been ongoing since governments were around. I think I read once that there was French interference in the U.S. presidential election of 1796.
Oh, wow.
Because they wanted Mr. Jefferson, I believe, to be elected president, and there was all kinds of things happening there. So I think by really being clear about what the requirements are for registration, about when activities meet those requirements, and by having a way that doesn't have a high administrative burden to register, that'll be important in making sure that it's easy for those who need to register. I think having the deterrent will mean that people who are doing these activities covertly will think twice about doing these activities.
Thank you so much. Mr. Greaves, 2 minutes, please.
Pardon me. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Boogman. In your earlier answer, you referred to the federal statutory definition of misinformation and disinformation, and you suggested that it was a narrower definition than that used in some of our peer countries. I wonder if you could elaborate on that in terms of whether you feel that the way that misinformation is currently defined is overly narrow and potentially therefore misses other relevant activity that seeks to interfere in our electoral processes, and whether as Commissioner you would be willing to consider requesting government to expand the definition to capture the appropriate scope in your view.
Yeah, and maybe I was using that as an example and not specifically meaning the definitions of disinformation and misinformation, but more what the requirements are for registration in the Canadian Foreign Influence Transparency Register, and what I have seen in some of the other countries that have these registries. So, for example, in the U.S., the FARA law, it really addresses any activity that aims to change public opinion, whereas in our own law, it has to be aimed at political and governmental processes. So there could be other activity that could be happening that is not specifically focusing on those processes. In that case, it wouldn't require registration. And so, I think I've read a lot of different debate on either side as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. As I said before, I think the fact that the requirements are set in regulations is very good because it allows future flexibility. I'm also cognizant and a bit of a realist. Having a narrower definition will make it easier to set up the office, to get the office up and running, and it will avoid risks of just being overwhelmed by everything, by too much inputs coming in. But I think part of what obviously should I be appointed to this role, then I'll be looking at how the model works, and obviously looking for whether I see any potential gaps in it, And I would have the ability, should I be appointed commissioner under the law, to issue reports, not only an annual report, but special reports on subjects under that. So,
Thank you so much, Mr. Bookman. That's okay. No, we do like a thorough question or thorough answer here at PROC, but do have to move on to Madame Normandin. 2 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. Pour les inscriptions.
Thank you. For registration, we can expect that some people to do it, but there might be some complex situations, proxies, when money's going from one country to another, so you'll have to work with CSIS. How will you ensure that these files don't fall between the cracks? Because with the creation of new entities, it's easy to shift the blame. How will you ensure that you are proactive and that you avoid situations where the blame is shifted onto someone else? That's another good question. It will be important to understand the different mandates of the organizations. And the mandate of the Foreign Influence Commissioner is clear regarding the registry and the activities which would require registration. That is the Commissioner's mandate. The other agencies have their own mandates. It will be important to establish what the different limitations are and which agency needs to act depending on what happens. Thank you very much.
Mr. Bookman, for being here. We will be suspending the meeting to go into camera, so everyone, Mr. Bookman and everyone behind him, you can go wherever you want, but you can't stay here. So we are suspended to go into camera.